I'm Rebecca Camacho, and I'm very excited to welcome you all here to this show and to this conversation. This exhibition assistance has been something that has been sort of brewing and simmering in various ways for a very long time. It is in many ways a very personal show, I think for all of us involved, but it is also sort of a universal conversation, something that is larger than just this group of 5 artists. So I am pleased to introduce David Gilbert, my dear friend, Wyatt Kahn and Daisy Murray Holman, who are, David and Wyatt are artists in the exhibition. Daisy is the executive director of the Artist Legacy Foundation. She's also the daughter of one of the daughters of Elizabeth Murray and spearheads that estate. And so we begin. I guess I'm going to start by just asking everyone to introduce themselves and sort of talk about your connectivity in this show, in this group of people. David?
I'll start. Hi, I'm David Gilbert. Thank you, Rebecca. This is such like a, it's very poignant to be back and see all this work some of my work from 2008 that I haven't sort of seen since then. And so I worked for Tony. It was my first job after undergrad, and it was a very interesting first job to have. And I worked for him from about 2005 to 2008, and learned a lot in his studio, and can kind of talk more about that. But I think sort of one of the things that's really interesting about this show is that you pulled work that I haven't seen since it was hanging on the wall in Tony's studio, and then work that I was making at the same time that I was working for him, plus like a piece that's more recent. So kind of to see the development of how the practice has changed over almost 20 years. I don't know, so it's like an interesting thing to see in the physicality of it. Yeah.
I'm Wyatt Kahn. I have many connections. I went to high school with Daisy and also Alice Carriere, who is Jennifer Bartlett's daughter. And so I really grew up, my high school years were often spent at Elizabeth and her husband Bob's kitchen late at night and sneaking in through their studio to the terrace to smoke cigarettes and drink beer on their balcony, which was like an incredible New York just evening experience on a summer night. But I later did an internship at both high school internship. They both let me intern at their studio instead of taking a class, and so I spent a few days each doing things there. And then later, I ended up working at Tony's studio through a friend from 2011 to 2012, 2010 to 2012. And then, strangely enough, David and I also were in one of my first exhibitions we were in together. What David said I agree with. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, a little nugget before we passed to Daisy, is that I knew that the work, these paintings on the right here, are from when I worked at Tony's in 2011, 2012. And what I found surprising, actually, is this painting of mine just to the left, which is from this past year. I always thought that the work of mine that connects most to Elizabeth's were the multi-panel works that are kind of what been known for over the years. And this work actually has the least, very few multi-panel intensity, but the kind of playfulness of it reminds me so much of Elizabeth in a way. And just the twists and turns and the spirals and the fleur-de-lis and things that she would just kind of scribble in these elements. And I was surprised because I never thought about this work in terms of Elizabeth's work. And when I thought about my work in terms of Elizabeth, there was always something else. And that was just a very pleasant surprise yesterday when I came.
Hi, I'm Daisy. I am Elizabeth Murray's daughter. And I also, Wyatt was one of my best friends in high school. And I just met David today. And on Zoom the other day. And I've known Rebecca professionally and now personally for the past number of years, just being in the Bay Area and being in the arts. And thank you, Rebecca, for having us stay and being really working so hard over the number of years for putting together this show and thinking of such a like a wild idea at first, but something that is really a through line for most artists in this world we live in, of having an assistant or being an artist's assistant. And especially growing up in an artist's home, even though my mother was not somebody who had active assistantships, there wasn't always a person in the studio working with her, but there were people around, and most of her friends had assistants, one of them being Jennifer Bartlett, always had numerous assistants. So part of being an artist was that you would have an assistant. So having a show about that and putting them together feels like a beautiful conversation. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think this show in many ways, the seed of it really started, at least, for me, in conversations that David and I, were having. So, the gallery program includes, Tony Feher and David Gilbert as represented artists, and so they are part of the gallery identity and part of my thought process pretty consistently. And so to get to this idea of this dialogue between those two artists, was an easy step. But then to expand it, to Wyatt was also an easy step for me because I knew him, personally. But then I didn't realize, it came up later in conversations, that Wyatt had worked, for your mom and had also had this connection with Jennifer, and that's when it really became full circle. Because Tony Feher worked for Jennifer Bartlett from 1985 through the early 1990s, and that was sort of where that circle really completed this group of people.
We also worked at Paula Cooper, and where
Yes.
Elizabeth was showing, and I know that Tony and Elizabeth probably had many a conversation during that time.
No, the connection points, are exponential.
And the way that I met you is like I was working for Tony and you were working for another gallery. And so sort of we were both not doing our own thing yet as younger people, and you were always very encouraging and were like, send work, show me work, what are you working on? And I sort of think that it's sort of the way that maybe, the world evolves and people, how you meet people and artists and people who work in the art world sort of find each other in these sort of longer conversations. And that was also sort of pointing that I've known you now for many years, and we have this Tony connection.
Yeah. So I wonder, sort of keeping it specific to this idea of assistance, being an assistant or being sort of a younger artist in a more established artist, space. What sort of, even just thinking baseline logistics, like what were you responsible for, in Tony's studio, David, or Wyatt, and the various studios that you were working in? Like, what's sort of the umbrella view of what being an assistant entailed, at least in these scenarios?
I was the first person that Tony ever hired, and he hired me because he had never touched a computer before, and he said I needed to get a computer. And so we went to the Apple store like a few times. He was sort of hesitant about actually wanting to get a computer, and then we actually did it. And he was a fast learner, but I felt it's been interesting kind of sitting with the work and thinking about the work, because I was thinking about things that I learned from Tony in a more practical way, and then there was sort of like bigger ideas. I feel very lucky. I never made Tony's work before him. Like I started working 1 or 2 days a week, and every week I would come in and there would just be new pieces on the wall or new pieces on the floor. And I feel like as a young artist, I felt lucky that I wasn't sort of like laboriously making someone else's work, which I think would have made me maybe bitter and jaded. But instead, I feel like I got this sort of like ethos from Tony. And after the computer stuff, it was sort of admin and packing up work, but I think also sometimes I would go in and I would be there and it would force him to like respond to emails. So I was just sort of there so that he would do some of the logistical work that he had to do.
Yeah.
And I think the things that I learned from him, I always think about materiality, which I think a lot, like the artists in the show are all very, make things with their hands on some level. And just seeing Tony's work sort of like not in JPEG form, but in person coming into the gallery, there's like this rawness of material. And I feel like I learned so much from him to sort of like not overdo materials, but sort of let them shine as a material. Like don't, like, do what the material sort of tells you what to do. The material will tell you what to do, and then like leave it a little bit. I feel like I learned that was a big sort of lesson in materiality from Tony. It was like to always let the materiality of what you're working with sort of shine through. And when I think about it, like working for him, I went to art school, but working for him is sort of like where I learned the most. Because like seeing an artist and seeing how they work and how they navigate the art world, and when they do a show and then they fill up the studio again after the show, like, you don't really learn that in school. But sort of like I feel like that sort of had an influence on me that all my schooling didn't really.
Yeah, it's a different experience.
When I was 18 when I did the internship with Elizabeth and Jennifer and I think Elizabeth, and I really just hung out at our coffee table and talked. Like we just, I definitely did not help with any kind of thing in the studio. I was really just hanging out and chatting with her. Jennifer, I organized slides, which was definitely part of an assistant and not the most, kind of hands-on thing. Tony, I also, we went a lot to Home Depot, there was a lot of time that was spent at Home Depot, and there were a lot of time also that was spent at this restaurant near his house called Lucien, where we would, often he would decide not to work, and we would spend a day at Lucien hanging out, but drinking. And, when I worked there, he had decided to make a body of work that he needed someone to help him make. And that was very interesting because my experience at the beginning was similar to David, where I was helping computer and organize, and he had this very extensive rug collection that I would be constantly moving the rugs around. His studio was these two warehouse spaces that were connected, and one was just kind of an exhibition space where he would all his objects, which were his collection of materials, would be presented everywhere. But one had it was just rugs that he would just lay out, which was incredibly beautiful and strange and unlike anything I've seen. And he had a touch for putting things in the right place. But he wanted to do this body of work that involved holding a tube and pouring water down, and meticulous, and then also he constantly would spill water all over me while he was pouring it from up on an 8-foot ladder, and I'd come home soaked in colored water. But it was amazing. And then he made the show, and that was when he was showing at Pace, and he made this incredible show, beautiful show about the bodies. But what I really learned from Tony and also from Elizabeth, just because I knew them well, is how to be a human in the art world. It seems I learned all the things about materials but hearing Tony hang up the phone and be so nice to his dealer, but then hang up and be so angry. But he always was these people are working with you and you treat them with respect, and you never are disrespectful. You tell them honestly if you want something, or if something isn't working, but you never are rude or disrespectful, and you hang up and then you're rude and disrespectful later. And I think Elizabeth also had that same mentality, strong, forceful, but also respectful of the people she worked for, and I thought that was quite really something I've taken with me, and I think treated in that way.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that's such a remarkable thing to get the opportunity to talk about is the person that you knew. And what I can relate was, my mother as a person, but also the way that I remember her working with assistants was more of sometimes cleaning up, sometimes organizing the paints, but it's really through one specific assistant who also happens to be my husband's uncle, who was also my babysitter. So that was the personal relationship. It was someone who was picking us up from school, bringing us home, and then he loved to organize, like color code paints. So that's what was happening. But it was more because he loved to do it that way. And she had a very personal relationship with Bob Gilbert, who was her assistant in the late 70s and early 80s, and he was helping her build her early stretchers. And I am looking at, it's really beautiful to see Wyatt's painting here and Tony's here, and seeing all of the different ways that you can have a shaped canvas and all the different ways that you can get there to have a structure. And the way in which her relationship with Bob Gilbert was, Bob and I had a conversation before this show that Rebecca and I were talking about how we can extend the conversation of assistants that beyond the show to an assistant that is not appearing in the show. And Bob Gilbert has been very private about his relationship with my mom, but he was willing to have this one conversation, and he mentioned that he was holding himself back because he felt like he couldn't go too far in the involvement. And what you just said, David, about as a young artist, you would feel like that was just, you'd be crossing a certain line, or you would get resentful to be too involved. And to hear that side of it is really important, that the younger artist working in the artist studio does have an impact on the older artist's career. And the end of her relationship with Bob Gilbert, with him being set free to continue her career and her moving on into a different shape of canvas, really changed the course of her career. So your assistant does have an impact on you. Like, you're the human that you're sharing a space with in your studio has a direct impact. And I think Jennifer had a very different relationship with her assistants. And she, in a way where everybody was her assistant in a certain kind of way. At her memorial, her friends were telling the story where, because at her memorial, Rhapsody was on the walls at MoMA, and people had been with her at the time where she would just have them come over to her studio in the 70s and help her work on the piece. So everybody can be an assistant all at once.
Yeah, well, it's funny you bring that up, because there is kind of in tandem with the extension of the conversation, you know, that you have with Bob, kind of the more expansive connections within this body of people. I had a separate conversation with two artists who were running Jennifer's studio sort of from the late 70s through the 80s, or were very involved, you know, whether running at one point in time, maybe not for that entire expanse of time. But, you know, the way that that dialogue kind of coalesced was that, you know, really at that period of time in New York, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that, you know, it felt like, you know, there were maybe 100 people, like in the art world, like in terms of artists, like it was a smaller community, and there was so much interconnectivity because, you know, people lived in the same neighborhood and everybody worked for one another, and you were helping each other get jobs or pulling into different projects and things. And so there was this consistent sort of overlap in varying ways, you know, that led from, you know, working on a project on a movie, to then working in an artist studio, to then traveling and helping put together a show in a different city, to, you know, and it was just all this interconnectivity, because at that point in time, maybe obviously from a certain perspective or a certain type of art world or type of artwork, that it felt like it was, you know, there weren't that many people, so you were sort of all in the mix together. But I also wanted to touch on, Daisy, another thing that you were talking about sort of the, you know, the personal relationships, like the, you know, the person who, you know, was sort of the mainstay kind of assistant, if your mother ever had a truly bona fide assistant, was this person who had this more personal sort of relationship with your family overall, you know, and in your household. And I think that that's an interesting side of being an assistant, is that, you know, there is it is a personal relationship. There's a trust. You are letting somebody else into in many times kind of your most secret, sort of intimate space of of the work that you are trying to make before it actually goes into the world. There's a very sort of raw and vulnerable spot to let another person into that world. And I wonder if David and Wyatt, like, do you feel like that's accurate, or is that your, I know, David, you do not tend to work with assistants, but Wyatt, you have brought assistants into your practice now. Like, what's the thought process on that?
I went through a period before COVID where I had maybe 4 people working, or like 2 people full-time, 2 people part-time studio, and I think right before COVID, I started to actively decide that was like, I just wasn't enjoying it. I enjoyed them, and I also felt responsibility for them and because they were all artists, and their livelihood. Like, I didn't want to, there was no reason to not work with anybody anymore, and I also wanted to make sure, and I would find stuff for them to do even if it was not necessary, but I really felt disconnected from my studio and the work, the way I used to work, and I didn't quite know how to get back. And then when COVID kind of started to happen, people kind of drifted into different ways. And then I decided it's funny, because you were talking about Steve, right?
Yeah.
Who's funny because I also worked for Steve, which I forgot about. But I ended up hiring my brother-in-law and to help in my studio because he wanted to get to the United States, and it was an amazing decision. And then after that, my nephew and my father, when he retired, helped with some things, and it led to a whole bunch of different problems, familiar problems. But it also, and it was bad. It was better. I have become an artist who refound the intimacy in the work and kind of went away from having that kind of studio model and really enjoy it and think it's better for the work and for my health, and I do enjoy working with my family members when they come in and help with the project, and it's totally ridiculous, but it's better for me. And I
I think thinking about this, I think something I learned maybe, or I got from Tony, was that when I'm in my studio making things, it's like I want to be by myself, and I want that, like, I'm sort of like, what I'm fighting for is time alone in the studio to make things, and that's sort of like the sweet spot for me. And I definitely think that's sort of like the ethos of Tony, that you come in the morning and he's been up at night or up early in the morning making something. When I worked for him, I think he was at a different career point.
It was the opposite.
Yeah.
For me.
I sort of took that, but I make photographs, and I'm at the point where I've realized I'm a very good printer, but I'm not a great printer. So now I work with someone else to help print the photos, because that's something that I like, having someone else's eye on.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think all the artists in the show make work that is like pretty personal, and so I imagine that there's this sort of like personal, vulnerable thing about having someone see it for the first time, and it's not necessarily your best friend, but it might be your assistant, but why there has to be sort of like trust between these people. And Tony, I worked for Tony for 3 years, but then he totally became my like mentor and friend, and he was sort of like my gay dad. Like, he was like, I have a real dad who's here and great, but I sort of needed but sort of like a gay elder who, like, I would call, and when I was having my first gallery things, and be like, is this weird? And he'd be like, yeah, that's weird. And but we would also talk about like boys and relationships, and sort of like he was he was polite and thoughtful, and his advice was always very sound. And so like he was like kind of, he extended beyond just being his assistant into all these other sort of like roles and relationships after I worked for him.
He was a beautiful person.
What?
He was a beautiful person.
He was a very beautiful person.
Very
Complicated guy, but very
complicated,
beautiful. Yeah.
very beautiful. Yeah, but I agree. I mean, you know, I think what you both were talking about as being assistants and not wanting to interrupt the artist, I think it comes from the knowledge, even as a young assistant, that the stuff happened, that like the magic happens when you're alone, and to like interrupt that process in any way or overstep would be kind of breaking some kind of sacred relationship or something. And I think now for you, and also for me, and I know for Elizabeth, Tony, and Jennifer, that those hours spent with the work and trying to understand the work and the wonder and the, what it was doing and how to make it respond in some way to what was going on in the world or in your life is the challenge. And as you get older as an artist, it gets harder and harder to kind of like find that thing, you know, that juice. And,
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I'm looking at Anthony because there's a show up at Bamfa right now, the Penny Cooper and Rena Rosenwasser collection, which everyone should go see if you haven't yet. But there is this Jennifer Bartlett piece, for example, seems very clearly to me a piece that she did not make with the help of an assistant, which is really very like touching and sweet and personal. And maybe this aspect of the conversation where an assistant is a personal relationship with artists who are making personal work, and yet they're not necessarily having a hand in the work. And in the Bamfa show, you're seeing Bartlett work that is clearly an example of a work that was probably made with the help of an assistant of somebody. And you can see she has these like, it's like a yellow dot and a blue dot. She's telling them how to mix the colors and to make the dots. So it's a real it's an instruction of how to go about it. And that sometimes it's not going to work out with a person in your studio because they're not going to give you their personal space, which is similar to how it is when you are an artist's child, where you are, artists communicate to their children how to give them the right amount of space in the studio, or learn how to be a quiet assistant in the studio at the same time. And that is also providing a certain amount of support, I think.
did you ever clean up, organize paints or clean up brushes or stuff for your mom?
Yeah, I would wash brushes sometimes. Yeah.
I mean, your mom and Jennifer had set, you know, a decades-long, you know, close friendship, and you know, from you know, what I have read, from totally not personal experience, you know, from sort of the beginning stages before they were who they became in the art world, essentially.
They actually met here.
I read that.
Yeah.
At Mills, right?
They met at Mills
Yeah,
College because
yeah.
Jennifer got her undergrad at Mills in 1963, and my mother was getting her MFA there, 63, 64.
And yet, I mean, how their studios functioned, you know, seemed to be almost kind of polar opposites. Where your mom's studio, you know, was singular to her, and Jennifer's studio was, you know, just had this constant kind of rotation of people in it. Like, I don't know how much their personal friendship sort of overlapped, like into your home, if there was like a lot of shop talk about, you know, that kind of thing, but.
It's something, actually, when we were on our Zoom call, Wyatt said, these are all such completely different artists. I can't imagine 5 are different artists. And actually, I'm sitting here thinking, wow, everyone has so much in common. The overlaps and similarities. And Mom and Jennifer are 2 people who were so wildly different and yet had so much in common.
Yeah.
Jennifer is a person who did not like to be alone, ever. She really wanted company at all hours of the day. And so that is how she wanted her home to be and her studio to be, and you can see it in her work at the same time. And that, like, a busy, busy mind. And my mother preferred a quiet, meditative space. I think sitting and having coffee with Wyatt is an example of that. Like going around and spending time with our animals. There's a little doggy right here that's getting lots of pats, but that example of the way that they would spend time with each other, where Jennifer would come to our house to spend time, but it was more often that Mom would go to Jennifer's studio to spend time and would hang out with Jennifer, and they would chat and look at Jennifer's work. That felt like a more common way that things went, because there was more busyness happening in Jennifer's studio.
Yeah.
Did your mom ask for feedback from you about her work? And like, did you?
Yeah, she asked for some feedback, but it seems like it was more of a, I don't know, being the child of an artist is having the work be a part of your entire visual background. And for us, her studio was always in our home, except for a brief period of time. And we lived somewhere, we moved to another place, and her studio couldn't be in the house. And she didn't like that, so we moved somewhere else so her studio could be in the house again. And our brother always said that we had this perfect life because our mother was both this very successful person who got what she wanted, who loved her career, but also was a stay-at-home mom. So she was there when we got home from school and cooked dinner and was always around to help us out and just be open and available for us. She would be open to talk about her work, but it was almost like when we came home, it's not that the studio doors closed, but that she pretty much stopped working.
Yeah, there's a shift.
Did Tony ever talk to you about his work? Or I don't really, I trying to remember.
A lot.
I know he had insecurities about exhibitions when they were going on, but actual work, I felt like when he finished a work, I would come in the next day and he'd present in a way for me to look at it, and if I didn't look at it, he would want me to look at it, but he never asked me if it was good.
But I think it's so interesting is that I think what's coming, I've never talked to you about this, I think what's really interesting is that the years that separated our working for Tony, we also worked for the same artist, but at such a different point in his career.
Yeah.
He wasn't showing with pace when I worked for him.
Right.
And so I think he was maybe more in a production mode when he was working with you. So I think he maybe was experimenting more or something so I think it was a different, I would come in and he had just moved, one of the first things I did is we moved him from the Lower East Side, this cramped storefront to these gigantic studios in the Bronx. And so I would come in and they weren't as full when he first moved there. So I would come in and there would just be all these little sculptures around.
Yeah.
And he kind of wanted to talk about every single one. And that was a big thing. But I think it was a different era. I think by the time you were there, he was more making an exhibition and just.
He'd also had a couple assistants. I was his third assistant,
Right.
so he had gotten into this thing with.
How was he talking about his work? Would he want to talk about the idea of the work or how things were placed?
Sort of both. Yeah. I think maybe also gauge, it wasn't that he would necessarily want my opinion, but maybe gauge a reaction or something. If I was just sort of wow. And then sometimes you'd come back and something would be reconfigured or something would stay the same.
That was he was both very confident and very insecure. and
all of us.
Like all of us. But the work, if you did respond to a work that was presented, he would get immediately grumpy and annoyed with you. And
Sure.
I had this amazing job for the first 6 months there, which was Tony would go on vacations and these long trips because he was in a period of both success and he joined a big gallery. He'd had made some money, but his career had kind of reached a certain point and the prices were very high, and they had a thing where he was trying to take the next step, and it was not. And so he'd gone on these huge 6-month trips or 2-month trips all over, and he would ship back 14 suitcases or 10 suitcases. He would buy suitcases, and he had never gone through them, but they were not just like things, some of them were things he bought there, like the rugs in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or wherever, but some of them were just literally things he picked up off the street. And he wanted, and we did this, we built these shelving units and we organized everything. I went through probably 100 suitcases, and like big check suitcases, and put everything into certain sections by like whether it was in marbles or bottle caps or types of bottles, and we meticulously organized it. At the end, it really became this incredible collection of materials and I think that actually hurt his ability to make work. Like I think
it was too much.
Because it was too
options.
ordered.
Ah.
I think he liked it kind of where he'd reach in and find two things and find a magic.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
he wanted this way where like, okay, here are all these like baby jar bottles, here are all these Coke bottles, and when they lined up, they became so beautiful
He didn't
lined
want to
up.
mess it up.
They didn't want to mess it up, and it like actually like kind of fucked with him.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I felt bad because I was doing what he asked me to do, but in some way I'd like hurt his like ability to just like reach into a suitcase, reach into a memory and create a new
And see
memory.
something juxtaposed next to something
Exactly.
else, and it creates a spark.
Yeah.
Did either one of you ever work for anybody else after working for Tony in that as an assistant in that same capacity?
Yeah, I did. I sort of went to grad school and I was like, I'm never being an artist assistant again. And then after grad school, reality set in and I worked for 2 different artists in LA after grad school.
Okay.
But had very different relationships with them. Like, I was at a different point and I sort of like had my career and they were personalities, but not like Tony, and we weren't like friends. I would go in and there would be a list of things for me to do and I would do them and then I would go home.
Yeah.
And it was a little more cut and dry.
Yeah.
I was in grad school when I was working for Tony, and after I stopped working for him, I did a few art handling jobs for a few months, and then my career kind of started, and that was complicated for Tony. I was surprised always that he would go to every one of my shows
Yeah.
and write about it and talk to me about it when he saw me in the street. But I was also disappointed that he never told me he went to see my show. And so I bumped into him.
Not
Like-
the opening, like during the run of
During the run of the show, he would go and when I saw him, he would talk about the work in the most eloquent, like deep way, and it made me so sad that I didn't have that conversation with him and
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
But I think Tony was, like you said, he was incredibly supportive and incredibly competitive at the same time. And I don't know, and I think his, like I said, my success was not on par with his success, but he saw my success, I think, as a threat to maybe some of his success, or a time when he was trying to take that next step, and I was having ease taking a step, and I think
Yeah.
that it was challenging for him. I mean, I see, I have similar feelings now, going to my career.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing what you understand only when you get there yourself.
Yeah.
Well, should we open it up if anybody else has any questions? Please.
I'd be interested if there are clues, not maybe specifically, but in any way that you learned that you took with you. You talked about the influence of being nice and respectful. I wonder anything both attitudinal and also with a brush or with a hammer or any of that.
Lingering skills.
I mean, I can't say like, I learned to stretch canvas from this artist, or I learned to do this, but I think that my experience in those studios taught me how to like look and touch and like bring together in a way. I mean, I know that's very like abstract, but it is like, it was like, I think David and I were saying the same experience. You got to come and have nothing there, and then the next day you'd show up for work and Tony had created magic.
Totally.
And that was like such the thing, and like Elizabeth too, like I wouldn't come there for like a week, whatever, and I'd come back, and like a whole part of this painting had been created, or this a drawing that would just be like lying somewhere, you know, and you know, I think that was something I really took. But I will say, really, they were my role models on how to be a good human being in the art world. Like that, they really, really showed me, and I would have made an enormous amount of mistakes in being not always kind and considerate to people, and I think about every day. The other thing is, I will say this, very Tonyism. I was 10 minutes late to one opening. I think to like my MFA opening, and Tony was there. I mean, he did go to some. And he looked at me and he said, if you're gonna throw a party, you show up on time. And he looked at me and he, like, it was a very wake, it was a Tonyism, and he scolded me, and I've never been like even a minute late. I'm always early because of that. And he scolded you about that too.
He just was always like, if you have an opening, you're there from the like 5 minutes before till the end, because people are there for you. He had a really, or not really thick, but he had a southern drawl, and he spoke really slowly, and he talked a lot. So it was like, but he was like, and he was just really sweet. I mean, he was sweet in interpersonal communication. He was always really sweet and really funny, and he had stories that he would tell a lot. Like when things were lost in his studio and then you find them, he would say, if it was a snake, it would have bit me. And I like whenever I've lost like my hammer in the studio, and then I like find it like right under mine, I'm like, oh, it's a snake. If it was a snake, it would have bit me. So that always goes through my mind. I think Tony's sort of like the thing that I learned from him, and it's not only in my own work, but it's like the thing that I look for in artwork is like a sort of like difficulty or like a toughness or like something challenging, because I think his work is really challenging and like kind of raw but also beautiful, and it's just like very complicated, and that's something that like I want as an artist in my own work, but also art in my
It's so funny because I look at it, I'm like, I want the effortlessness that he, like the fact that when I see Tony, like when I see that work over there with the brain with the ribbon, I'm just like, it was meant to be that way. And to change anything would be to change, and that's what I look for, the opposite, like the effortlessness of it. They both are there, yeah.
I had a question. I remember reading in Philip Guston's book, I think it's called How to Paint. He relied on two people all the time. He called them to come and look at his work for feedback. So I was curious if Tony, Jennifer, Elizabeth had one or two people that they would invite to come and give feedback about the work.
Tony, definitely not. Definitely not.
We could ask my dad. He's here. But my immediate response is that I think she was very open on the one hand to her beloved friends and her children and the world around her, but was very sure when something was done.
Yeah.
There was like an energy in it that all of a sudden was very kinetic, and then that energy was like it got turned off, and it was clear to her when. So it wasn't and if it wasn't about listening like a trusted advisor. It was like if she was asking somebody for something, then that meant there was an unresolved issue for her to pay attention to, if she still needed to seek advice. And maybe somebody could say something to help with a specific problem, but until she would, then it wasn't over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's so funny. My wife is also is a painter, and my wife, when she finishes something, she will text me a picture or FaceTime video, and then will immediately want to share it. And she gets frustrated at me because I do I covet the moment of finishing the work, and I don't want to, like, I want to savor it in my body, and I don't want to share it with anybody. I feel, and she's not here, she can talk about why she likes to share it, but I feel that I get maybe 10, maybe I finish 10 paintings a year, 12, whatever, And those are the 10 amazing best nights of my year. You know, the rest I'm searching for that. Like, and I'm not miserable, but like either working on something, reaching in process, and they're incomplete days, you know. But when you finish something, that day is incredible, and I want it to be mine, you know. And so I might show her like a week or a month or a couple days later, and just, but I do try to personally.
You know, I think that Jennifer and Elizabeth were trusted advisors to each other, and that is something that's very different from assistants.
Yeah.
Like, they
Yes.
were friends, and they had a friendship that began at a young age, when even though Jennifer was an undergrad and Mom was an MFA student, she was only a couple years older, and they were both really, and they were becoming, and they were fresh, and they were devoted to each other, and had a very deep trust and very open eyes to each other's work. And so it would be each other, our people in that space with each other.
Well, thank you everyone so much. Thank you.
Thank you guys.